northeast Africa lie the remains of a 5,000-year-old civilization. Ancient Nubia was once a powerful empire, with kings who rivaled the pharaohs of Egypt. Egyptians called it the Kingdom of Kush. But the Nubians could never quite match the mighty Egyptians, and by the middle of the 6th century AD, the Nubian Empire was lost. In the early part of the 20th century, archaeologists from America and Europe began to excavate. They unearthed remnants of a black African kingdom whose royal burial mounds revealed a bizarre culture of death. Here, hundreds of people had been buried alive alongside their king.
They were the king's servants, the king's property. They had to go with him. They lay down with their heads to the east, their feet to the west, with their few possessions. And then they were all buried.
They must have been buried alive. Whether they were drugged or not before they went in, I do not know. But it was a brutal sacrifice, appalling.
Why did Nubian kings conduct these death rituals? Did the ancestors of today's Nubian people offer themselves for sacrifice? Or were they murdered? Was this the first of the mass suicide cults which still exist today? How could people be so manipulated that they would willingly go to their deaths? A clue may exist in the African Sudan among the people of modern Nubia. This ceremonial dance has been performed by desert tribesmen for generations. As the dancers become entranced, they are almost possessed, slaves to the will of the priests who control them. It's a phenomenon that has existed amongst the people of North Africa for thousands of years, but it also has parallels across the globe to the present day. These are the 20th century members of an American death cult called Heaven's Gate. In 1997, 39 of its members proclaimed absolute faith in their leader, and with him, they committed suicide.
We came from distant space, and even what some might call somewhat of another dimension. And we're about to return from whence we came.
Marshall Applewhite, the group's leader, convinced his followers that there was a spaceship in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet,
The level above human.
and that it would transport them to another level. But to reach it, they had to commit suicide. Willingness to die for a belief is a concept that sociologists like Eileen Barker have been aware of for a long time.
People talk about dying for their faith. They do that in the Catholic Church. They die for their faith in Islam, in war, the jihad. They believe that if they sacrifice themselves, then they are going to go straight up to heaven. One could even say it's strange that it's so rare, given that we're promised this wonderful heaven after death. The question might be, well, why do so many people not commit suicide, rather than why do a few do so?
Dressed in uniforms, the Heaven's Gate members took a lethal cocktail of barbiturates and alcohol, laid down, and died. Their deaths were just some of many mass suicides that have occurred throughout the world in the 20th century.
The victims then had several minutes to wait until the poison took effect. Time enough for families to get together, and then to lie down together, to die together, and for children...
Jonestown, Guyana was the most horrific example of cult death. 900 followers of Jim Jones committed suicide or were murdered.
There were old people among the dead too. One of them a man of 108.
Experts on death rituals have found that 20th century mass cult sacrifices are linked to burial practices that began over 5,000 years ago and have been occurring in one form or another ever since.
It's a phenomenon that actually occurs throughout the world. Every continent effectively has an example. In some cases, we have over 300 individuals who have been killed to join their master or mistress in the afterlife.
Where did it all begin? The first evidence of an ancient Nubian civilization in North Africa, which dated back 3,000 years before Christ, came to light nearly 100 years ago. What made this civilization different was its bizarre rituals of human sacrifice. This mysterious culture evolved to the south of Egypt, along the banks of the Nile, the longest river in the world and the major artery across the desert linking the Mediterranean to Central Africa. Archaeologist George Reisner made the first discoveries.
George Reisner was an American from Indianapolis, Harvard man. As a young man, went to Egypt, began to excavate for Mrs. Phoebe Hearst of California, the wife of the famous publisher, and worked for her for a few years until her silver mine gave out, and she said she wouldn't fund him anymore because she didn't have enough money.
Reisner's alma mater, Harvard, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts stepped in to finance him. The archaeologist spent the next 38 years excavating in Egypt and the Sudan. Reisner pioneered a new scientific method of archaeology. He kept detailed diaries and precise registers. Between 1907 and 1911, he excavated 8,239 graves and found the first evidence of both animal and human sacrifice in Nubia. But Reisner made a fundamental mistake. He concluded that these African people were little more than a primitive Egyptian colony.
Reisner shared the views of a lot of his contemporaries that no African people, other than the Egyptians, with whom he identified himself as a European. I mean, they had made the Egyptians into virtual Europeans, and the Nubians were somehow enlightened Africans, but not as enlightened because they were darker skinned. So, I mean, he had this racist baggage that many people had in those days.
Reisner's apparent racism made him blind to a black African civilization whose kings, during the 6th century BC, had dominated the region, even rivaling the mighty pharaohs of Egypt. The Nubian civilization believed in sacrificial burial and life after death. An early Spanish historian described the royal death ritual.
When a king of the Sudan dies, they put beside him his jewelry, his arms, his eating and drinking vessels, and they bring food and beverages as well as some of his servants. Then they shut the door. Then the people gather and heap earth on his grave until it becomes like a huge hill.
But these royal burial mounds and evidence of this death ritual remained undisturbed until until the 20th century. The Great Nubian Empire spanned a period of over 3,000 years. The Nubians were traders, middlemen. They supplied Egypt in the north with exotic goods from the south, like ivory, leopard skins, hardwoods, precious stones, and gold. The word Nub means gold, and Nubia had its own gold mines. All along this part of the Nile boomed a thriving economy. In the northern Sudan, the Nile is full of rocks and rapids. In ancient times, where the river was impassable for ships, the Nubians created highways in the desert for the ancient caravans to cross. Modern highways follow the same routes, crossing the Nile at key points. The ancient capitals of the Sudan were stretched along these routes. Kerma was to the north, in the middle was the region of Napata, and to the south lay Merowe. These were the great centers of wealth for the Nubian civilization. Today, descendants of the Nubians still live close to the Nile, but the rich trade from the south is gone. Now they just rely on the river, fishing, and farming the narrow fertile banks. Life is hard. Each year the villagers face famine or flood. But now there is a new threat, the construction of a dam which will submerge the whole area.
All the land we have is between the Nile River and these mountains. For generations it has been our life. Now they want to build a dam to make power. They say it will be better for us, but if they do, it will flood our village and other villages. It means for us the end. We will have nowhere to live. Our lives will be worth nothing.
While the proposed dam does threaten the way of life for modern Nubians, it was ironically the construction of dams along the River Nile which led to the discovery of the Nubian civilization in the first place. When Egypt constructed the first dam at Aswan in 1902, a vast area was flooded. Many archaeological sites and priceless treasures were lost. It was when they started the second stage of dam building that George Reisner was called in to record and save as much as possible. Reisner made extraordinary discoveries. Yet his theory that the Nubian civilizations were Egyptian remained unchallenged until 1929. Then yet another extension to the Aswan Dam threatened more archaeological sites in northern Nubia. A little-known British Egyptologist, Brian Emery, and his co-director Lawrence Kerwin were commissioned to investigate the area. They began 200 miles south of Aswan at a place called Kushtul.
There we came across a large group of mounds, some of them up to 12 meters, 13, 14 meters high. But we walked about the site and saw underground quite a lot of broken pottery and bones of various kinds, some of them human bones. And that was a sign of plundering, and we felt sure that these were tombs.
These mounds had been noted by earlier travelers, but Reisner had never excavated them, and their significance remained a mystery. Even the local people were unsure of their true origins. Undeterred, Emery and Kerwin began to dig. Almost immediately, they discovered the entrance to a tomb.
we had to get in, and that was quite a job. So we had to push ourselves in and drop onto our hands onto the floor of the tomb. It was filled with pottery and scattered bones, skeletal material of all sorts. And finally, Brian got in after me, and we stood up, and we talked only in a whisper. It was very dark, and we could hear the sort of plop of plaster from the ceiling falling, out in dark corners. And then we shone the light around, and opposite there was a sealed door under a sandstone lintel.
What Emery and Kerwin had discovered was the entrance to the royal burial chamber of a Nubian king from around 400 AD. This was the last period of the Nubian civilization, long after the great Egyptian pharaohs. As Emery and Kerwin began to excavate, they found evidence of sacrificial rituals, but the victims were animals.
The whole of this approach was filled with the skeletons of horses and camels, and these horses carried silver harness, all of it in sort of late Roman style, and the saddles were mounted in silver-covered pommels, and on the front of the pommel was the figure of the goddess Isis, the favorite goddess of the Nubians.
But then they did find evidence of human sacrifice. The body of a slave. Was this part of a death cult?
He was on one side, and a palm fiber rope had been tied round his neck, and he must have been strangled. There was no sign of any crack in the vertebrae.
After excavating the tombs at Kushtul, Emery and Kerwin moved across the river. There, they found more royal tombs and the bodies of kings, complete with priceless treasures. These burials belong to the last ancient civilization to occupy northern Nubia. Here, too, they discovered evidence of human sacrifice.
We found a sacrificed girl, fully clothed, very good condition. I mean, everything was very dry. By her side, there was a satchel of leather, locked. And we brought this back to the Nubian, and Brian and I tried to pick the lock to find out what was inside. He was a much better picker of a lock than I was, and we eventually, after struggling with this, we got it open, and it contained all her jewellery, gold jewellery, inside. But it was a brutal sacrifice, appalling.
Emery and Kerwin had unearthed a Nubian civilization from the 4th to the 6th century AD with sophisticated burial practices and some evidence of human sacrifice. The evidence for mass suicide and a death culture was buried in Nubian graves 1,000 years older and 200 miles south of Kushtul in the Nubian civilization called the Kingdom of Kush. There, the Roman writer Diodorus had written of the strange burial rituals that existed when the Kushite kings died, further clues to a death cult.
Kings are chosen from the priesthood. When the priests were tired of their king, they ordered him to commit suicide. When the king kills himself, his servants do the same. This custom lasted for centuries.
This Kushite kingdom was in fact the Nubian civilization which George Reisner had discovered in the 1920s, thinking it to be Egyptian. 1950s, after Egypt started building yet another extension to the Aswan Dam, which obliterated even more ancient remains, archaeologists turned their attention to sites clustered along the Nile in southern Nubia. Reisner's mistake had been easy to make because the Egyptians had dominated the region for 500 years. But in the 8th century BC, the ruling forces of Egypt were split. As the pharaoh's control waned, a powerful Nubian kingdom emerged, which the Egyptians named the Kingdom of Kush. The Kushite kings even occupied parts of southern Egypt and began to think of themselves as pharaohs. They built pyramids and copied Egyptian burial practices. And one thing the Kushites and Egyptians had in common was they both worshipped the same god, Amun. Amun was the all-powerful creator god. He was the god of fertility from which all things came, including the king. But was he a god who demanded sacrifice? The Kushites believed Amun dwelt just outside their city, within a lone sandstone outcrop surrounded by a series of temples and palaces. The Arabic for mountain is Jebel, and Amun's home was called Jebel Barkal.
When you get up close to it, you're overwhelmed by this towering cliff and this bizarre rock needle and these birds that soar around the cliffs all the time, vultures and falcons and all these birds which have sacred connotations. It's not surprising that people immediately believed that this was the place where the gods lived.
Although the Kushite kings believed they were created by the god Amun, they did not believe they were immortal. To ensure transportation to the afterlife, they carried out elaborate burial practices, similar to those of the Egyptians. The earliest members of the dynasty were buried here at the cemetery of El Kuru. The original pyramids have long been destroyed, the stones removed. But Reisner had found here a series of tombs showing how Egyptian influence had changed the burial customs of the Nubians from being buried on beds to being mummified and encased.
They had themselves mummified, put in coffins. They used canopic jars. They used Chawabti figures. Of course, there's no evidence of human sacrifice in the Kuru cemetery.
It's easy to see why Reisner mistook the Kushite civilization for the Egyptian. All of the tombs had been plundered, but some of the wall paintings were undamaged, and the style appeared Egyptian. This is the tomb of Queen Kalhata, the mother of the last Kushite ruler to occupy Egypt. She's shown being led into her tomb chamber, where her body would have actually been placed in a mummy case on a bed. She's depicted on both walls. On one side, she's looking up as a mummy. On the other, she's rising as the god Osiris, coming back to life as a person reborn in the afterlife. The rule of the Kushites and their challenge to Egypt was short-lived. In 591 BC, the Egyptians' strength returned, and the pharaoh sent his army to put an end to Kushite pretensions to his throne. The Kushites were defeated, and the king fled 180 miles east, across the Bayuda Desert to Meroe, one of the wealthiest cities of his kingdom. The ruins of the old city of Meroe cover a square mile. On the hill overlooking the town, the Kushite kings built a royal cemetery with a pyramid for each ruler. In front of each pyramid was an offering chapel, and carved into the stone were reliefs of oxen, birds, and slaves. But in spite of the writings of the Roman historian Diodorus, neither Reisner nor any of the archaeologists who followed him found any evidence of mass suicide rituals. Clues to them lie further back in time. There was an even earlier period of Nubian history and a great city that controlled the land of Kush. And here, archaeologists did find what were perhaps the first, certainly the most horrifying, examples of a death culture. On the eastern bank of the Nile, George Reisner discovered the remains of a civilization at Kerma, which went back to 2500 BC, long before the Egyptians dominated northern Nubia. The climate would have been more tropical then. Lush grasslands with elephant and giraffe, and rich soil for cultivation. Ancient Kerma would have been an ideal place for human occupation. Here, there was an ancient city and a burial complex nearby. Each area had a massive mud brick building which the locals called defufas. In 1913, Reisner began his excavations. He called the mud brick building in the city the Western Defufa. It was over 60 feet high and had a solid flat roof. Inside were a number of rooms and a stone used for the sacrifice of sheep and goats.
It had a staircase running up through it, giving access from a series of temples down at the foot of this structure, going up into the roof, and on the top it was a platform. There might have been a small shrine on the top. It was a kind of viewing platform where people went to observe the sun, the moon, to worship some solar deity. I mean, we just have no idea, but it was a temple complex.
The mud brick Western Defufa seems to have been a shrine occupied by a priesthood who presided over Kerma's kings and could control rituals and communicate more freely with gods. The Western Defufa was built in at least 12 different phases and grew like a 20th century skyscraper. All around the Kerma site, Reisner uncovered sophisticated artifacts, Nubian pottery, some as thin as eggshells. He found necklaces made of turquoise, highly polished beads, and other finely crafted jewelry. Reisner also unearthed funerary decorations made from ivory carvings of wild animals. But even here, some objects were obviously Egyptian, reinforcing Reisner's belief that the city was merely a far-flung Egyptian trading post.
It's clear that there were probably many Egyptians living and working there for the king of Kush. But Reisner couldn't have imagined this. He didn't have enough information about the history, so he naturally assumed that it was an Egyptian site, even though it's about 200 miles further south than the furthest southern Egyptian fort of the period in which it was occupied. So he assumed it was an Egyptian fort of some kind, this Defufa.
Reisner could not have been more wrong. For the past 30 years, archaeologists have been excavating the ancient remains at Kerma, reconstructing the outline of the city center. What has emerged is the heart of a mighty black African empire. There was a typically African large round house, which was probably the audience hall for the king. There was a walled palace, which had many apparent Egyptian features, but dominating the city stood the religious center, the Western Defufa. The whole city was fortified and would have been defended by soldiers. Whatever the pharaohs thought of the Nubians, there could be no doubt that this was a highly sophisticated kingdom. But the most sensational part of George Reisner's discovery lay to the east, in the cemetery of Kerma. Here he found the extensive ancient cemetery with thousands of low circular mounds covering the graves. Here, too, was a second mud brick building, the Eastern Defufa. This was probably the funerary temple where the dead king would have been laid out ready for his burial. The earliest graves contained only the body and a few possessions. But successive generations of tombs revealed funerary customs and offerings that became increasingly elaborate and macabre. Here, at last, was evidence of an empire of death.
The body was always placed on the south side of the grave pit, with the head east, the feet west. Lying on its right side, looking north, the hands were sort of up to the face. The funerary provisions were always put on the north side of the grave. And when the grave was filled in, we find clusters of upturned pots on the eastern side of the grave. They're all there, turned upside down. It was as though the funeral participants made a final offering and just put the pots upside down on the eastern side of the grave.
Contents of the largest tombs, the royal burial complexes of the last kings of Kerma, concealed what was the most shocking: evidence of a will to conquer death itself. This royal tomb complex measured over 120 feet across, almost the width of a football field. The Nubians constructed a skeletal framework of mud brick walls to hold the earth and prevent it from blowing away. Each of the tombs was bisected by a corridor which ran from east to west. On the south side was the king's chamber, where his body was placed with all of his treasure.
All of his servants, his concubines, his men-at-arms, came into this corridor and took their places. They lay down with their heads to the east, their feet to the west, with their few possessions, and then they were all buried. The complete court, except perhaps the king's chief wife and his heirs.
In the largest mound, Reisner found not only the remains of the king, but the skeletons of 322 members of the royal household. Reisner believed that in their last moments of death, some were trying to escape. He wrote,
"They proceed not in the ceremonial silence of our funerals, but with all the ululations and wailings of the people of the Nile. After the bed with the body has been placed inside, the doors of the chambers are closed and sealed. The priests and officials withdraw. The women and attendants take their places, jostling in the narrow corridor. The cries and all movements cease. The signal is given. The crowd of people assembled for the feast, now waiting, ready, cast the earth from their baskets upon the still but living victims on the floor and rush away for more. The emotions of the victims may perhaps be exaggerated by ourselves. They were fortified by their religious beliefs and had taken their places willingly. But at that last moment, we know from their attitudes in death that a rustle of fear passes through them, and that in some cases, there was a spasm of physical agony.
Between them, the last four kings of Kerma had nearly 1,000 victims with them when they died. It's difficult to see how any civilization could survive such a systematic elimination of its people. Experts on death rituals, like Mike Parker Pearson, have discovered that this kind of death culture seems to happen at crucial milestones in history.
The moments that human sacrifice as an accompaniment to royal burials occurs are actually very short-lived. But these are crucial moments for the formation of early states. What we're seeing is the installation of a new hierarchy, a new power structure, when political power and religious power are often linked together in the form of one person. And that person has the complete power of life and death over their subjects. And of course, there comes a moment when these kinds of enormous displays of autocratic power are no longer necessary in the same way. And we find this almost like a brief fluorescence, a short moment, and then it's over.
Mass human sacrifices are, it seems, the ultimate demonstration of an individual's power over his people, particularly at times of crisis.
Now, if you would hold your patch, see, it says Heaven's Gate awaiting.
With the 1997 Heaven's Gate suicides in San Diego, California, it was the demonstration of the strength of one individual's charisma and powers of persuasion.
It means that even the mind that you had as a human is aborted, and the soul that was given to you is filled with next level information, next level mind, and a new creature is born.
I've made the conscious choice to willfully exit this vehicle or body that I'm wearing. I'm fully aware that to stay here, to reject the choice to go to the next level, to separate from the kingdom of God, is suicide.
We've all worked very hard, and we've all tried to prove to our older members that we're worthy of the effort and sacrifice they made.
But for those that we've left behind,
we're going on to something greater and better, and that we hope that someday you will understand this and you might join us.
The discovery of the 39 Heaven's Gate bodies stunned the world. The deaths had been planned in every detail. Even the reasons for the cult members' mass suicide were made clear in their farewell video. But what were the circumstances surrounding the Nubian cult of death? Did the people of Kerma die voluntarily, or were they murdered?
You do have to have some sort of leadership, some kind of inspiration, somebody who will persuade you that this is what you really want to do. And that doesn't have to be in a religion. People can be persuaded that, like the kamikaze pilots, that they've got to sacrifice themselves for the country, for the group. Other people might believe that they've got to do it because they're worthless, they're only part of their husband, as with Sati. So that there may be, that's not a charismatic leader, but that's sort of definition of the self as only existing in relation to another. And that might be the case with some of these ancient burial sites that we've been finding.
Many of the Kerma skeletons and remains have been stored in Switzerland in the Geneva Museum. Using modern technology, scientists might finally be able to discover whether the victims went willingly to their deaths in a macabre ritual, or if in fact they were simply murdered. Although they were over 4,000 years old, the heat and sand had preserved them. Some even had hair and skin.
Teeth in terms of attrition.
Osteopathologists can tell age, sex, and to some degree, cause of death from bones and teeth. Can they use their expertise to discover the manner of these deaths?
We were trying to look to see whether there are any unique characteristics in this population, features that might have told us about their behaviour in life. For example, scarification might have been practised as it is in parts of the Sudan today, cuts on the face and across the forehead, and some of those can be deep enough to leave marks on the bones, and we examined for that, but nothing was found at all. However, with the teeth, as we know, in Sudan today, often tooth ablation is practised. This is where the top front teeth or the front teeth at the bottom are knocked out. This is a sign of membership of a particular group, an age group or a societal group. And we did find examples where teeth had been knocked out in life, clearly not accidentally.
Having established that the skulls were Nubian, the next step was to look for unnatural breaks and evidence of violent death. Close examination of the bones and skulls in the laboratory showed that prior to death, the people had been in good condition.
It's difficult to imagine that there would be hundreds of people simply lying down and being buried alive. It's probably far more likely that they were taking the kind of drug to make them unconscious or kill themselves beforehand, although it's more appealing to me that they were not dead when they were buried, because I think that the idea would be that they would remain alive in the afterlife. Simply go directly to the new place and serve the king.
But if they were drugged, what with? Along the banks of the Nile grows a weed which the locals call sakarang. It looks harmless enough, but to the villagers it's a dangerous drug which makes you feel intoxicated. If you take too much, it can make you unconscious.
Those who use it just use it as a type of intoxicating material, and it is worse than hard whiskey. If you take too much, you will become completely unconscious for days. Even if they hit you with a knife, you will not be conscious. So we hope that we get rid of this plant, because it is very dangerous.
So could the forensic experts find any traces of sakurang in the victims' bodies?
Unfortunately, although the bodies were very well preserved, there were no stomach contents, and so there was no way of seeing if they'd taken a drug immediately before death. Clearly, if they'd taken a drug some considerable time before, we might have been able to find it in the body tissues.
But even if drugged, the victims may not have been entirely willing to die. There was one more vital clue. George Reisner had taken glass plate negatives and a darkroom with him to the Sudan. He'd photographed the bodies as they were excavated, showing the exact positions in which they were buried. Most were along the walls, but not all.
I went through the excavation photographs to see if I could determine whether people had really moved after they laid down in the tomb, whether they had been writhing about in agony or fighting to free themselves, as Reisner suggested. And on examination, I found this was almost completely unlikely. Very, very few of the bodies were in anything other than what I would consider normal position. That is, the same position as the principal burial, lying on their right sides, faces to the north, with their hands tucked up under their heads. And any variant from that position could easily be explained by the weight of soil landing on them after they were dead, or at least deeply unconscious, and the soil could then push part of the body over. So I cannot imagine a situation where you have a lot of people being covered over and being conscious in any way.
So experts conclude that it's likely the victims of the Kushite rulers were either drugged or in some form of deep trance. But either way, they went willingly to their deaths. These mass sacrificial burials at Kerma lasted over 900 years, until the 16th century BC, when the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose I launched a major campaign. He defeated the Kushite army and returned to Egypt with the dead body of the Kushite ruler displayed on the prow of his ship. The signs of burning and destruction found during excavation suggest that the town of Kerma was sacked. Although the might of Kerma was crushed, its distinctive burial practices continued to occur. They were observed by Roman historians, and although the evidence appears to be lost, the death rituals re-emerged 1,000 years later in the burials at Kushtul.
The conception of death has changed dramatically within the last 10,000 years of our existence, and what we're seeing with these burials is the notion that death can be transcended, that there is another world to which the living will go. And I think more importantly, that afterworld of the dead is conceived of as a mirror reflection of the world of the living.
Recently, in the West, there's been far more of the understanding of an afterlife that is actually this world. About a quarter of the population say they believe in reincarnation. So there's more of a thinking it's okay here rather than we're going to escape to something better or something much worse. Belief in hell has been going down, belief in heaven has been going down, but there is still belief in something after life, that it doesn't all end.
There is no doubt that belief in an afterlife and a promised land eases the difficulties of life. But what the scientists and archaeologists cannot tell us is whether the recent mass suicides of the 20th century herald a revival of the ancient death cults. Only the historians and archaeologists of the future will be able to tell.